All right. I think we will get started. So I'm really excited to be joined, in addition to Andrew Carr from the Fundamental Edge team, by David Plon, who is co-founder and CEO of Portrait Analytics, an AI-backed, AI-powered investment research tool. In my initial conversation with David, I found his background really interesting because he's one of us. He's a certified stock nerd, just like us, having spent some time at David Greenspan's Blue Ridge Cub, effectively Slate Path Capital, and then at Baupost Group. So having kind of learned from, two great investors, he's been in the trenches and then taking that experience into building AI tools now gives him a really unique angle and similar to angle to where we come at. And so I'm really excited to chop it up today and explore some of these concepts. I've also found that, this summer I was trying to stay up with, this model, and I've like totally become so far behind on the new model updates and what's happening in LLM land. And so it'll be a nice check-in with David to kind of give us his perspective, building with these tools day in, day out, what they're capable of doing. So thanks everyone for joining us. One of the big topics we wanted to cover today is idea generation. And part of the idea that we'll do in this webinar series is we're trying to touch on a little bit of every bucket of the investment process. We'd like to do modeling. We'd like to do today idea generation, et cetera. And so I have kind of a shortish deck that I will start with now and give kind of the setting the stage a little bit with some of the fundamental edge frameworks on idea generation, and then pass it off to David to take us home. So thanks for being with us today, David.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me. Totally pumped to share a bit about idea generation in the world of AI.
Great, great. A reminder for everyone: this will be this will be recorded, distributed afterwards, and then we should have meaningful time for Q&A at the end. So feel free to drop any questions you have along the way in the chat, or simply wait until the end and raise your hand. So I'll go ahead and share my screen on idea generation. All right. Perfect. So AI and idea generation, aside from our curriculum that we talk a lot about, is this concept of idea velocity. And idea velocity is not just some unimportant concept, but actually can be a differentiating factor between a successful junior analyst and a senior analyst. A PM that we interviewed in our speaker series one time told us that, what I thought was a great quote, that a portfolio is only as good as the quality of its underlying ideas. And so alpha generation, outperformance is only a function of how many good ideas you can put in the portfolio. In modern markets, it's, the buy and hold idea is much harder to come by. And so I think modern hedge funds are turning their books probably faster than they did, 5 or 10 years ago. And so the result of that is ultimately idea turnover and new idea flow into a portfolio as a critical dimension of success. We talk about this concept of idea velocity and the number of ideas that are needed per team member, depending on your type and idea of structure, right? This can differ. When I was at a Tiger Cub, I always tried to generate at least 2 ideas per month. And so building and orienting my whole process around building a machine to do that. At a market neutral multi-manager investor where there's a larger portfolio, faster turnover, the pace of that can increase. And so for those of you who have walked in the trenches like us, you know that there's never enough good ideas, right? We always need more ideas. And the pace with which we can digest new ideas is a really important gating factor, right? Because we don't want to shortcut the investment process. We talk in Fundamental Edge how a typical deep dive due diligence process could be anywhere from 60 to 100 hours, right? We have, in my opinion, there's kind of relatively standard base load due diligence, a typical kind of due diligence process that I will do on any idea I look at, irrespective of the idea. And then we're taking what we learned from that process to tailor the analytics to take that idea home. Because ultimately the core debate and the key driver is going to be different idea to idea. So how can we take a bag of research tricks and tailor those analytics, whether the question is a price mix analysis or capital markets dependency? How can then we can go deep into that core driver to drive differentiation? So from this perspective, this can be anywhere from 60 to 100 to 200, 300 hours of work on one idea. And so the fundamental question is, how do we ensure that we're not wasting 100 hours on a bad idea, right? In this process, we're sourcing information from filings and modeling and public statements and management interactions and channel due diligence and industry experts and all data, right? So this is a cumbersome process, right? We've all watched Billions on Showtime, and it's a very entertaining show. But the reality is, if you took cameras into a hedge fund, just watching people read through 30 transcripts and build 14 models would be a really boring, watching paint dry experience. But that diligence is what I've observed from my experience. That's a fundamental underpinning of good investment process. So fast forward to AI. I mean, to me, one of the interesting potentials for AI is not to put us all out of business, but to arm us with tools for better efficiencies, to take some of the rote exercises that we do as investment professionals, make those easier, right? And that's already been happening with technology. When I started on the buy side, I had to go request 20 sell side models and then spread them by hand, line by line, to see line by line consensus. Well, now I could subscribe to Visible Alpha. I used to do 30 calls to Wendy's franchisees to see how January sales were tracking. Now I can look at credit card panel data, right? And so there have been efficiencies, this trend of efficiencies in the investment process accelerating over the last 5 to 10 years. And in my mind, AI is just simply another tool to help us do that and to help us thoughtfully do that, right? So to me, one of the promising dimensions of idea generation and AI is, can we speed up this process, right? Can we get through more ideas quickly? Can we turn over more stones to find potential ideas? Can we up level the quality of ideas in our portfolio, right? And so that's really one of the promising potential concepts for me. A few frameworks that we talk about, just a baseline on idea generation. A big part of the challenge of idea generation is a filtering process, right? If I'm a generalist, for example, I can look at every stock in the US. How do I filter 6,000 stocks down to the best opportunities? This is a stylistic consideration more than anything, but I think there are some frameworks to disqualify names that can be helpful, right? A few frameworks we talk about are a lot of idea generation comes out of simply industry coverage, right? There's been a trend towards closer and tighter industry coverage, teams of the large multi-managers of 6, 10, 12 people, each covering a subset, 30, 40, 50 names. When you cover 50 names very closely, you start to understand the cyclical and secular trends. You start to understand the idea of change, what's happening, being able to identify the winners and losers. So idea generation comes almost naturally out of that process. I've also been a generalist, and idea generation as a generalist is a much more challenging task. And David has been a generalist as well, too. So I'm excited to hear his frameworks on how he efficiently leverages tools into those processes. There are a few things that we've always done, simply kind of stock screens. We can screen quantitatively for a number of metrics. I've always found, or I've come to learn, that to me, idea generation has become more of an artistic, qualitative exercise rather than a quantitative exercise. My kind of belief is, by the time you can see a metric in a FactSet terminal or Bloomberg terminal, it's probably already priced into the stock to some degree. And so the days of just screening for low price to book stocks and buying ones that look interesting, to me, that's much harder with the evolution of markets. And so it takes more creativity, takes more pattern recognition. So in terms of idea screening, we also kind of talk about a high bar, right? Like the general framework that I've been impressed with is that if I look at 100 random stocks, 90 of them are most likely to be uninteresting. We're looking for that 10% piece. We're looking for those outliers, whether it's on valuation or revisions or relative performance, outliers on quality or other dimensions, right? So we're really looking for the exceptions rather than the norm in idea generation. We talk a lot about why stocks get cheap and some common characteristics of mispricing that I think are the fundamental foundations of idea generation. Understanding that concepts like neglect and apathy or change and chaos or controversy and uncertainty, looking for these qualitative attributes that are likely to be a precursor of cheap stocks. I love, for example, like broken IPOs or spinoffs before spinoffs become hot, or other areas where there's just the market's not really paying attention here. Cyclical versus secular confusion, I'll show you example of. The market still, in my opinion, constantly gets wrong, peak on peak and trough on trough setup. Situations where there's too much complexity, but there's a path towards simplification, or any sort of distaste or forced selling. So to me, qualitative lenses of idea generation have been more powerful in finding great ideas in my career than quantitative screening, which speaks to the promise of LLMs, which are large language models that are, very strong theoretically in the language and distillation process. An important framework in idea generation to me is HHT, that is a framework that we've kind of evolved and adopt in our process, where you find an idea, it doesn't mean it's a thesis, right? It starts with a hunch, right? So if I'm looking at 6,000 stocks, I might be looking for 300 hunches, right? Within this 300 stock base, maybe those ideas fit a pattern recognition, a business quality metric, something about the idea that makes it potentially interesting, right? This doesn't mean it's going right in the portfolio. If I invest based on hunches, I'm not likely to be a consistent or profitable investor, right? And so the HHT process to me is about starting with a hunch and then up-leveling that with work to a hypothesis, and then up-leveling that with work to a thesis, right? To me, that's part of the reason LLMs are promising. A lot of the pushback on LLMs in the early years was like, I can't trust this data. There are these hallucinations, right? I don't know if I want an LLM to build me a financial model where each of the individual inputs are critical in terms of my forecasts. But to help me generate more hunches that then I can go validate or invalidate with my research process, yeah, bring it on. Let's do that. That sounds great. Because ultimately, during this HHT process, I'm looking for a gauntlet of disqualifiers, right? The onus is on me to disqualify my own idea, right? I have 300 hunches. Let's go disqualify those and know when to pull the ripcord, right? Not spinning our wheels on uninteresting ideas. Accounting red flags, kick it out. Subpar business quality, kick it out, right? And, Buffett talks about his two hard box. And so I think this is a whittling process. Are you going to miss some great ideas in that process? Yes, for sure, right? But this lattice work of distillation, has helped me through my career. So what are, again, this is very stylistic, but if you're going to whittle stocks from 300 down to 30 down to 3, how might you do that? You might look for stocks that have, high quality businesses that have sold off by 20%. You might simply look for exceptional businesses with high free cash margins, high ROICs, high organic growth. You might look for situations where you think there's a big expectations gap, a trend shift or an inflection where the market hasn't caught up yet. You might be looking for a new innovation where the market hasn't caught up yet. You're looking for typical recurrent stock setups, different valuation metrics, and a number of fundamental patterns, right? You kind of pick up this bag of tricks as an investor over time. Oh, this company has 12 manufacturing facilities and they're going down to 3, and that should lead this sort of gross margin improvement, and the street's not modeling that correctly. And so these fundamental patterns evolve over time. You start to pick these up when you're in the seat. We talk about a concept called a sniff test of like, okay, if I have a hunch, what can I do to kind of smell that idea a little bit more without spending 60 hours on a name? What are some of the metrics or frameworks that I can run that idea through to kind of give me a green light or a red light on that idea? Does it align with my mandate? Does it have a growth algorithm on revenue, EPS, profit that meets my bar? Does it have a business quality that meets my bar? Does it have financial strength or business momentum or potential to beat street expectations or baseline cheapness? Again, very stylistic. Your process is your process for picking ideas. These are simply frameworks that you can apply. And then once we have that hunch, we talk about a 12-hour due diligence process. Again, don't spin your wheels for 60 hours, but how can we then adjudicate that idea with 12 hours of work or 6 hours of work or whatever that means for your process to evaluate on kind of an initial basis on those ideas? Another big framework you hear a lot about an idea generation. This came directly from a PM I worked with. He said, at this point in my career, it's pretty much all about pattern recognition. He's sitting there just like, does this look like other ideas that I've liked and done well in the past? And does this look like ideas that have been unsuccessful for me in the past, right? That obviously, can cross the line of bias, right? So objectivity and always kind of constantly updating your mental frameworks around pattern recognition. But the reality is, ideas rhyme, right? You see a lot of similar ideas as a stock picker over time. One that we talk about is secular versus cyclical confusion, right? If you take the blue line as a fundamental business momentum, right? In reality, what you ought to expect logically for a cyclical business is when your revenue and margins are at peak, you might want to compress that multiple in anticipation of those fundamentals rolling over and expand that multiple in anticipation of those fundamentals reverting to the mean, right? In reality, all too often in markets, you see a peak multiple on peak valuation and a trough multiple on trough valuation. So investors talk about these as peak on peak and trough on trough setups. Still some of my favorite setups, right? So it's like you still see these happening all the time. Like, why did Peloton trade to where it did during COVID? Why did some of the tech bubble winners trade to such highs why did Netflix trade so high when it was receiving COVID era demand? Why did it trade so low when they were going through that hangover? And so cyclicality in businesses is still a thing. And the market price discovery mechanism just still doesn't do a good job. Whoever said the market is a discounting mechanism hasn't played in markets. The market is more of an observation mechanism by my assessment. The market looks at how fundamentals are performing and prices of stocks in line with those existing fundamentals. So an anticipatory framework of fundamentals and understanding of pattern recognition, like the trough on trough, helps to bring order to chaos in idea generation. We'll talk about other sort of long alpha buckets too. Like, growth acceleration is another one. The setup where, hey, maybe the stock's expensive, we're growing 10%, but something is happening and we can accelerate to 15%. Those are sort of ideas and setups that are, dearly looked upon, desperately sought on the buy side. Set up simply like compounders and mispriced catalysts and simplifications and change engines, whether it's a new management team or regulatory change. And so if you've been in the seat long enough, you start to get your own bucket of alpha ideas. And that's the interesting part about AI to me, is like, can we start to codify some of these ideas and start to hunt for some of these ideas rather than make this a purely artisanal process? Other ideas for, should I dig in? How do I go from 6,000 down to 300 to 30 to 3? Is there a new management plan that I can underwrite and assess and look at the market implied probability of success? Is there simply just a fundamental exceptionalism? This is a great business, and can I find it at an interesting entry point? Is it cheap on normalized margins or normalize business results in a segment? Does it look like an early stage winner? So I can do the analog analysis. Is it something big change in the business or the industry? The market tends not to price change as well as it prices equilibrium, or simply if other investors come to find this idea early, and I can leverage their work or use their positioning as a sign that maybe I should dig in and do my own analysis, obviously with care. So that's really just kind of a few baseline frameworks that we talk about for idea generation. Why do I think AI is interesting? Idea generation is obviously a very high value added part of the research process. The typical junior analyst stack of, hey, go build this model, hey, go do this management call, hey, go do this, to me is relatively commoditized, right? When people talk about AI as being a good intern, I'm like, a good intern's not that helpful in my research process. Like, maybe it saves me a little bit of time. But that work is kind of mostly commoditized. Like, I don't know, you can build a business around being a good fundamental intern. Analyst success to me comes more from self-contained idea generation. If I can run a portfolio with 9 analysts who are all idea generators across healthcare, right? That the analysts who can consistently bring good and successful ideas into the portfolio will be a much higher value added team member than the analysts who simply can update models well or do research that I direct them to do well. So this is a big kind of gating factor in those of us that become simply a good junior analyst to senior analyst and ultimately PMs. The other kind of fundamental thing about AI tools is accuracy really doesn't matter in idea generation. I mean, it kind of does. If it's really wrong, that's annoying. But we're trying to just create hunches here, right? Just give me some potential ideas. Like give me an initial sign that, hey, the key driver in this industry is inflecting. Oh, okay. Let me then go dig in and do my own analysis. And so these tools to me, as I would see them in the process, is like telling me how and where to spend my time. That is our most valuable resource as investors. And that to me could be very helpful. And then LLMs are language models. And so idea generation to me, I thought when I started in the business that, oh, I'm going to do all these whiz bang Bloomberg screens. I'm going to find great ideas out of those screens. Like that is just generally not the case. All the great ideas I've had have come out of just reading a lot, paying attention to industry trends, reading broadly, distilling, putting a lot of information into my head and then trying to distill that down to what's changing, what's inflecting, where does the market have it wrong, where does the market have it right. And so ultimately LLMs are great at distilling large pools of information down into insights. I think also when we talk about idea generation, there's a potential. Some of the triggers that come out of idea generation are also great tools for thesis creep prevention or idea monitoring. If I'm looking for inflections, for example, in potential ideas, I could run those same tools into my current portfolio, right? If I'm short something and I expect the key driver to inflect negatively and I see some signs it's inflecting positively, right? That could be an early warning sign to get out of that position or flip my positioning. And so I think to me, idea generation doesn't just stop at the new idea. Some of these frameworks also overlay into portfolio management. So I will stop there. And I will hand it over to the true expert on the call today, who has a deck and will walk you through a continuation of these ideas. So, thank you, David, and please take it away.
Thank you, Brett. Yeah, you covered a lot of ground there that I was probably going to repeat. So I will definitely go a little bit quicker through some of the stuff I prepared, and really excited to kind of introduce myself and how I thought about idea generation in your all seat, and where I think AI can really fit in and accelerate a lot of the process that Brett you just described. So let me go ahead and share my screen here. One sec. I think Brett, you need to enable it. Okay, I think we're in business now. Okay. Can you let's see, can you see my screen?
We
All
can.
right. I always feel it's important to start any deck with a cartoon, which is what I used to do when I used to make these as investment memos as well. So, yeah, excited to chat a little bit about idea generation and AI. Let's see. Here we go. So just I'll give a brief kind of introduction on myself. As Barrett mentioned, I was an investor before venturing off into the world of AI. I started my career at Barclays Capital in a proprietary trading group, doing event-driven trading, typically kind of across the capital structure. Was a long-short analyst at Slate Capital, and most recently was at a large hedge fund in Boston called the Baupost Group. And across all the different seats I was in, I was always an industry generalist. So it was very much dealing with the problem of how do you go from 6,000 names down to a much smaller number of that. And to the extent a new idea gets onto your screen, maybe it's an event-driven situation that just got announced. How do you kind of rapidly build context around those names? The idea for starting to work on the machine learning and AI world as relates to all this was when I was at business school in Silicon Valley. And this is just when AI was kind of getting started. And it always seemed obvious to me that at some point, machines doing large scale pattern matching would be quite relevant for investors who I think, Brett, as you said, in a lot of ways are doing large scale pattern matching. And that's what kind of led to starting Portrait Analytics. which is the leading firm today with respect to leveraging AI for finding new investment ideas. So I'm going to very briefly cover a few thoughts on idea generation from my experience as an investor. And I'll also go briefly over kind of the state of the art with LLMs today, and as Brett spoke about, like why I think they're well suited for idea generation. I also want to make sure this is really practical for everybody, and there are certainly great tools out there um, for doing this at an advanced level, but AI has become one of the great things about it is it's just so available. Like $20 a month for ChatGPT is nothing compared to the value of getting a new incremental idea. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about some practical tips that I think could be really useful for anybody today to be taking advantage of. And then I'll also give a quick preview of Portrait Analytics and what we're building. So I'm going to go through this quickly, but I screenshotted this, Brett, from the first presentation you did, and I think in my mind the biggest needle mover in terms of my performance in any given year was just the quality of the ideas I actually spent time on. And a fun way to kind of illustrate this was I did a Monte Carlo experiment where I took three different analysts. Analyst A has the entire S&P 500. Analyst B and C have the S&P 500, but the top 5% of performers are not available to them. And then I have these analysts randomly select ideas from the S&P 500, 20, assuming they review about two a month, and they have a 50% or 60% probability of making the quote correct investment decision with the benefit of hindsight. If a stock has outperformed the market in the given year, then the correct decision would be to buy it. So I set up this fun Monte Carlo analysis, and I thought what was really interesting about it was ultimately the idea generation piece is just so important, right? Even an analyst who has no edge at all in terms of actually making the right decision about a stock, if it comes across their screen, is going to outperform an analyst who, given a particular security, is going to get the right answer 60% of the time. And having a batting average of 60% in this business is exceptionally good. A lot of funds will talk about that being like a yardstick to kind of shoot for. And so it just speaks to like if your idea generation process is missing out on some of the best potential ideas for you, like that's going to be really hard to overcome. And so I think as everyone knows, right, like the trade-off with idea generation is you'd love to do the Warren Buffett thing and just read the 10K for every single business in your universe, but that's a little bit unrealistic considering the time constraints that folks have. And so the way that I have often seen myself and others kind of bend the curve, so to speak, is by pattern matching to different mental models. There's Rhett mentioned a few. I always like, for instance, the one that I probably most often went to was something called like a turnaround, where it's a high quality business, it's a clean balance sheet, reasonable valuation, and the stock's underperformed over a multi-year period. There's a new CEO that's arrived, and the company's now executing a turnaround plan. And if I could find setups like that all day, I would be very, very excited and feel like there's a very high probability of spending time on ideas that are both actionable because I think they'll be profitable and are within my like power zone as an analyst. And I believe this is exactly where AI could fit in. So let me talk about a little bit where AI is today and where I think it might be going as it's highly relevant to kind of everyone on this webinar. So just a quick recap of, and if folks want to get into the nuts and bolts of what's actually happening when these models do work, very happy to do that in the Q&A. I spend my weekends now reading machine learning papers, so I can totally geek out on this as much as you'd like. But very briefly, right, like I think over the last 3 years, there's been just a step function change in what is capable, what these models are capable of. In 2021, I kind of thought of it as AI could be good at semi-rote cognitive work at scale. So the classic things you'd see AI used for around sentiment classifiers or extracting the name of management teams, across different filings. Today, I think AI is quite good at what I'd call human level shallow tasks. So things like writing a Python script, to do something with data that you might subscribe to, or if there's a 50-day analyst day transcript and you just want 3 data points out of that, it's very good at doing that type of work. Um, that said, I don't want to overstate where AI is today, and I think this is actually a fantastic visual that kind of sums it up. So this is from OpenAI's latest model, O1. They every time they publish a model, they or release a model, they publish what's called a system card, and you can often, I mean, they're all publicly available, and it's fun to kind of dive into them where you can really see how they test these models before they release them to the public. And one of the great analyses I saw recently was what you're seeing on this chart here, which is basically they subject every leading model to a pretty challenging series of exercises to understand its accuracy and capability to do long range planning and tasks. And you can see on this chart here, like where models are good today are tasks where it takes humans 10 to 30 minutes. Now, the difference, of course, is that these models can do things in a 30-minute task in a matter of 1 or 2 minutes. And then, of course, they don't get tired. As long as you have an NVIDIA GPU working, you can continue to have this done multiple times. So we're not yet at the point today where a model can fully take over like a week's worth of work for a given human, but it certainly can do a lot of really important tasks and challenging tasks at a high level that I would kind of classify as a couple hours or a couple or 30 minutes over an afternoon. And then one thing I'll just mention here is I'm sure some of you all are familiar with O1, which is the latest model from OpenAI. What's really interesting about this model is historically the name of the game for training a large language model was what was called pre-training, which is essentially feeding it the internet, making the model as big as possible, and having it learn relationships based on the training data that it's given to be able to predict future or text in response to a prompt. What OpenAI has started to do is actually train the models to be really good at thinking in a system two type way. So when you prompt O1, it spends a lot of time first thinking through what its answer should be before responding, depending on the nature of the task you give it, much in the same way that a human, if you asked an analyst to answer a challenging unit economic question about a hospital chain, they would spend some time thinking it through before giving an answer. And this seems to be kind of the latest frontier with what these models are capable of. And I think there's just a few examples. Like clearly today, these models are not on their own out of the box incredibly reliable or capable at a level that is at the same consistency as a human, but there are certainly inklings of these capabilities becoming useful in really challenging domains. I thought this quote was just incredible coming from the preeminent mathematical researcher in the world. And I also came across this paper recently, which blew my mind, which basically stated that in a double-blind experiment, they found the latest AI models to outperform human PhD researchers in terms of generating novel, creative ideas. And so clearly, if the models are able to do this in various fields, like why not investment research? I guess the last question I'll leave you with, well, in this part of the conversation where I'll talk about models, is I think the most important question, probably representing the fate of trillions of dollars of market cap, is what the next generation of models looks like. If we go back to 2022, GPT-3, it's kind of hard to remember what the pre-ChatGPT era looked like, but certainly we weren't doing webinars about the future of AI and investment research. GPT-4 came out in early 2023, and that basically has been the state of the art up until very recently. And models have kind of converged around the same general capability set that I was describing earlier. The real question is if you take the next big foundation model that gets trained, whether it's called GPT-5 or something else, and you also add in the ability to kind of think about its answer, so training it to the reason through the way a human would, represents a really big question mark about what that actually looks like. And I don't think anyone has, maybe there's a very small number of people who know what the future of that means, but I certainly, at least to date, betting against continuous improvement in model capabilities has been the wrong side of that trade. So that's a quick overview on kind of what's been happening with LLMs and where I think their capabilities are today. And now kind of bringing this back to using these models for idea generation. So I'm going to start with some specific tools and tips that I think could be if I was in the seat of being at a firm where I didn't have the budget or the compliance buy-in to start working with an enterprise solution and just wanted to figure out how I could leverage AI within my research process. Here are some of the things that I would certainly be doing. So in the first case is these are some of the widely used tools that I would kind of recommend. I think Notebook LM by Google is fantastic. I'm sure many of you have seen the podcasts that people are creating, and I think that's a really fun way to quickly learn about a company. I always used to listen to like Tiga's calls when I was like going on a run or something like that, and I would very much want to do the same thing with a Notebook LM podcast after throwing in a bunch of company filings and transcripts. There are other tools. Anthropic has Claude, where you can create projects and also just query a very, very capable model. The same, of course, exists with ChatGPT. And then there's tools that are kind of more purpose-built for browsing the web and extracting information, which I will reference Perplexity Pro and, of course, Bing AI. Which models to choose is always an interesting and kind of evolving question. One thing I would highly recommend doing is going, if you really want to get into the guts of what model should I be using on a regular basis for different tasks, I would highly recommend going to Scale AI has their own leaderboards where they have private tests that they've put together and run these models through. The reason that's important is whenever you see benchmarks getting put out, that whenever one of these model providers publishes a new model, they will reference common benchmarks like MMLU. The problem is a lot of the queries and questions in those benchmarks have been leaked into the internet. And as a result, the models have been trained on those tests. So it's helpful to have like a frame of reference for being able to go back and look at how these various providers perform on a private data set, and the SEAL leaderboard is a useful place for that. And I think the punchline, though, of this is today, models are pretty comparable. O1 seems to be the most robust in terms of reasoning capability, but very clearly, like Sonnet 3.5 is not very far behind. Gemini is often in the top five, and the advantage of Gemini 1.5 Pro is it has a context window of 2 million tokens, which roughly means you could stick about 1.6 million words into a Gemini prompt and have it deliver an output, which is pretty astounding. And just for frame of reference, the average 10K is about 100,000 words. So and the average transcript is probably about 10,000 words. So just to give you kind of a frame of reference there. But yeah, so the models today, I'd say largely have comparable quality, with O1 probably being the best at the moment, with the main limitation of O1 being that it's not able to actually ingest images or anything other than just straight text. So I'll go through a few tips that I think would be really that I would love to have if I was just getting started today with trying to integrate AI into my research process. The first tip I would provide is build some of your own prompts that you can use on a regular basis. So in Excel, I'm sure many of you have, using one of the plugins from the large data providers. It's very common to kind of build an Excel template, and I often had like a one pager of all the key metrics that I cared about and some ratio calculations. So whenever I started doing work on a name, I just punch in the ticker and voila, I'd get a bunch of useful calculations that help me qualify potential new idea. That logic totally applies to AI. And so the best way to do that is to find a prompt that you can consistently ask whenever you start working on a new idea. And this is an example of one. I'll walk through some principles that I find really useful for prompting AIs, but this is one example that I think is really fun, which is a common workflow when getting to know a new idea is you want to be able to highlight any red flags, and maybe if you're on the long side, that might put you off it. If you're on the short side, it might get you excited. And one of the great ways to do that is changes in the risk factor section of a 10K, because that typically they have to disclose um, any potential risk as defined by their lawyers. So that's not written by the management team, that's written by the legal team of a company. So oftentimes you get like an interesting tidbit or two there. And I'll walk through kind of the format of this in a moment, but like basically the high level is like these prompts can be very structured the same way you can think of building formulas in Excel. You can build verbal formulas in a prompt. Um, some principles behind this prompt are, and I'd say prompts in general when working with AI are kind of the following. And I'll also say these all change over time. If I did this presentation 2 years ago, that it'd be a totally different story in terms of how to prompt these. And with new models like O1, it changes it somewhat as well. So this is something where you just constantly need to be experimenting. But generally, this is kind of what I find to be useful. The most important thing is to put yourself in the mindset of someone who's writing an email to a sharp but not so context aware student, and be as specific as possible where it makes sense to be specific while also leaving room for the sharp student to use their IQ to reason given the proper context. Something that often comes up is people often wonder, okay, AIs hallucinate. How can I make sure that I'm getting factual information? And the answer is all AIs hallucinate. And then hallucinates, actually, I wouldn't even call it the right term, because every AI is generating text and it's using something to do that. It can be one of two things. It is either using context that you gave it. So you're giving it a 10K and you're asking it to pull something out from it, or you're asking it to use its memory. And the most important thing is, if you're looking for a very specific fact or data point, do not trust an LLM's memory. It is going to be imperfect. And it might still try to answer your question, but it is likely to be wrong. What LLMs are great at are general world knowledge, general capabilities, and the ability to reason over context that you give it. A few other quick tips. I find it's usually helpful to have a few examples as you develop your prompt. So don't just do it with one company. Have 5 companies where you know what you've already done work on them, so you know what the output should be. And doing that gives you the ability to kind of tweak your prompt as you go, and you figure out what's working and what's not. As you can see, like I heavily structure my prompts. This syntax is called a markdown. It's very easy to learn. It just uses like hashtags and dashes to kind of speak to the machine about like what the format and the structure of this is. Triple hash marks like this are different levels of headers and so forth. Um, I like breaking up into sections, and also really importantly, like give sometimes, if it's a challenging task, give the LLM space to kind of think and tell it, as it can first think out loud before it answers your question. And also, if you don't tell the model that it can say, I don't know, or the answer is not clear, its goal, and it's been trained to try to be helpful. So it will make something up if you don't give it, or it sometimes will try to make something up if you don't give it an out to be able to say, I don't know. So those are some of the prompt engineering principles that I find to be quite useful. And just, I think it was kind of fun. Like I know Brett, I think has covered healthcare services. I spent a lot of time on healthcare services, and Humana was a name I spent a lot of time on. And I thought this was interesting. Like, here's that prompt that I ran. I put in the last 2 Humana 10Ks into ChatGPT. I ran that prompt. Here is one of the notable changes in risk factors. The company, they beefed up the language around the risk of changing government policies and reimbursement. What do you know? 2 months later, they missed their Q1, and they say, and one of the key reasons, of course, is they were negatively impacted by reimbursement. So just a fun example of like, this is something where actually going through the diff and reading the 10K and going back and then reading the previous one probably takes like an hour to do that exercise thoroughly and pick this up. This is something I picked up in 30 seconds, because this prompt is working well. Afterwards, if anyone is working on prompts and wants feedback, please reach out to me. I love kind of brainstorming on prompts, and it's like my favorite thing to do these days. So always happy to kind of kick a prompt around a little bit. Second tip I'd say is, as you're getting to know a company, in the interest of being able to like kill something quicker or frame it up, Ask questions as you read. Like when I used to, before the pre-AI world, as I would read a 10K for the first time, I would just write down this very long list of questions. Whenever there's a term I didn't know, I'd highlight it and have to go back to it. But because I'd have to research that term, as I read the rest of the 10K, I wouldn't really know what it actually meant. It is so easy now to just access general information. And so in this example, like if you're reading Humana 10K, you don't know what Medicare Part D is, like, yeah, you can Google it. You're going to get a lot of Medicare plans, Part D plans advertising to you, and you're going to have no idea what it is because no senior citizen really understands it that well if they're just reading the kind of the top SEO and SEM results. But if you ask Claude, it's going to give you a really nice overview here. And I would also say, importantly, like this is the type of question factually that the AIs are fine with. If you were to ask how many people were on Part D last year, that would be a bad question to ask Claude. It's not going to have that information memorized in a trustful way. But but the general kind of industry knowledge of what is Medicare Part D, it will be able to answer that. And this is like a really good starting place for you to continue to dig in. Third thing I would say I would be doing is like this always kind of popped up for me as a generalist, right? Like you see some sort of news and the question becomes, okay, what are the read-throughs of that? And historically, that's been a really painful exercise to go through because if Humana missed earnings, then you want to figure out if you don't know that industry, it's not obvious, especially given the complexity of healthcare services, like who are the peers, who are the customers, who are the suppliers, and what does this mean for that? Again, this is like a type of general knowledge that these LLMs are today reasonably good at. And the nice thing is, as Brett pointed out earlier, this doesn't have to be bulletproof accurate to be useful, right? Like the goal here is just to give you a little bit of a nudge and check this out. And as it turns out, this is a pretty spot on answer. But like maybe they put in DaVita as an example, and that's not really like it is a healthcare provider, but it doesn't really fit this. That's okay. You'll be able to very quickly figure out whether it's relevant or not. But the most important thing is maybe it pops up for you that United Healthcare has a big Medicare Advantage business as well, and that actually could be relevant. Last thing, I guess two more tips. One is I think in terms of being able to chat with your documents. Today, I find Notebook LM to be the best off-the-shelf tool for that. So a fun example of this is I'm sure anyone who's spent a lot of time doing diligence calls, you end up saving them down somewhere, or maybe you have a research management service, and it can be hard to go back and actually pull that together, especially if you're gonna now. I would oftentimes be writing the memo after I finish my research. And I'm like, wait a second, like what did everybody say about this one particular topic? And it's a pain to have to go back. This is really helpful. And actually, I'd say really feeds into idea generation because a lot of times you'll have an inkling about something that you've looked at in the past. And it's hard to kind of rebuild all that context of maybe you looked at a field 2 years ago and now a new data point has come in and you want to be able to query like over all the work you've done to quickly figure out whether there's something relevant to do. And so this is a good example. At one point, these are actually some of my personal notes that where I was considering making an investment in a company privately that was going to go into basically do a Medicare Advantage type startup. And I did a little bit of research, and this is like a great synthesis of kind of one of the key questions that I talked about on all the calls. So I would highly recommend using Notebook LM to kind of upload a lot of your call transcripts and or notes or anything like that, and being able to query over that in a useful way can help get you from hunch to like this is worth spending time on in a really good way. And I guess lastly, I would say the most important thing is honestly just experiment and have fun with these models. Now my wife is sick of me like using advanced chat mode GPT at the dinner table. So you kind of have to rein it in a little bit, but these things are just so fun to play with. And so this is like one example of like as you play with these models, you start to get a real feel for what they're good at and what they're not good at, and that starts giving you ideas of like how they're progressing and where they could be useful. So this is like a fun example where like 6 months ago, if you took the best model and you said, let's play rock, paper, scissors, shoot, you have it go first, then you always pick the thing that beats it. It would have, and you ask why, very clearly, right? You're going second. but the model wasn't self-aware enough to be able to connect that dot. And most recently, and you can see here, this is the O1 model because you can see it tells you how long it thought for. The models are now capable of figuring that out. Now, to be fair, I'm not the only one that's come up with the rock, paper, scissors, shoot game. And so it wouldn't surprise me if the most recent models were trained with that data or that example in their data set. But generally speaking, like, I don't know if anyone plays like New York Times Connections, a game. Like, that used to be something these models could never do, and now they're pretty good at it. So just have fun with it, and continue to mess around with them, and you'll learn a lot about where they could be useful. So now I'll just give like a very brief overview of kind of portrait. And um, excuse me. And you know, if folks kind of want to learn more or get like a full demo, like please reach out to me. I'll have my contact information at the end of this and kind of the last page, and you can also just check out our website. But I'll show kind of a few examples. Well, I'll give you a high level of a portrait, and I'll give you a few examples of how something like portrait or other similar tools can be useful for idea generation. Very high level, portrait is a platform that helps fundamental investors first find the most relevant ideas that fit nuanced kind of quantitative and qualitative criteria. So really kind of fit into the mental models that you might have as an investor, as well as inspire new mental models based on research that you do. It's a tool that's really useful for learning the story behind companies and industries and kind of building that baseline context. So you can think of it as like a lot of those prompts where you might design to kind of replicate aspects of what a research analyst would do to build, frame out a new investment thesis. That's what we really specialize in having Portrait be able to help with. And finally, Portrait's fantastic at pulling on threads and going really deep on companies and industries and finding connections and data points that can really help flesh out a key investment factor or a key debate around a stock. Since we're just talking about idea generation, I'll show you a few examples of like what you can get using Portrait. So a few mental models that I kind of have that I encourage you to try out. One is finding smaller companies where you're going to have a real transformation in the balance sheet. And at Barcap and also at Baupost, I often looking at stories where the company is over-levered, and there's an opportunity, though, for the leverage to come down, which results in credit spreads tightening, reduces interest expense, and oftentimes improves the multiple and the viability of the equity. And so here's like a good example. And it's just actually kind of random. This was the first one that came up when I ran it, of Community Health, company over-levered 7.5 times EBITDA. And you can see here that they're in the process of selling assets and are evaluating further asset sales. And a billion in proceeds relative to a cap of 700 is pretty interesting. Another example that our system came up with is Allegiant, which is an airline I actually briefly flew once to a little bit of terror, and it's a same idea. Like here they have a business unit that actually is more so on kind of the resort side, I believe, and they're now looking to sell that to kind of bring down leverage. Another example, which is very common, and people generally have different ways of framing this, but I love like a turnaround self-help story. And I kind of mentioned that as like in my example mental model. Here are a few examples of that, like Starbucks. You can see our system kind of pulled that, the stock's down relative to 2021. Next 12 month EV to EBITDA is reasonable. It's not too much leverage, has a good ROIC. So there's something high quality in there. And they're dealing with real operational or execution challenges. And they've announced a new CEO in the past year. And so that kind of fits like that potential criteria. And similarly, like 3M is kind of in the same boat. They have a new CEO. And they're also going through a kind of a big kind of restructuring and operational execution improvement story. And the nice thing about self-help stories like this is if it's the right CEO, it's so much more like under the company's control. You're making less of a bet on like supply demand or macro or competitive dynamics. And if so, you're able to diligence that like the problems are solvable and this is the right CEO to solve it. they oftentimes can be really nice, researchable and uncorrelated theses for to have in the book. And then there's one last one I'll share is, and there's a lot of things you could do here. I didn't want to go too negative on the short side and call any companies out. But like here's an example of if you're looking for situations where there's maybe something questionable going on with the accounting, and I don't know Guardant Health at all, so I don't know if that's the case, but it was interesting that the system brought back this example of a company where free cash flow is negative and they've recently dismissed their auditor. And so like within Portrait, what we allow you to do is kind of build a lot of these yourself within kind of inspiration from our AI. And then as you start to kind of frame out the thesis, our AI will help kind of build those contexts. And then you can see in a number of these, we have case studies where it's a very kind of detailed, but also highly consumable deep dive into these companies and their history and their broader industry, such that you're able to, decide to dive deeper or kill it much quicker than normal. So yeah, that's kind of all I have prepared. Please feel
David, I
free.
want one in the chat that piggybacked right on that. How exactly does Portrait work? You just type in, give me small cap companies that are transforming the balance sheet. That example's off the shelf, or would you have to set it up? Also, the extent you can share what is going on in the back end. That's from anonymous attendee.
Yeah, absolutely. So a few different things. So one is we kind of give you the option to do either. You can kind of just type it in natural language and our system will kind of generate its own plan to go research. And you can also, though, specifically define that for you or define what the system should be doing. We also, with our customers, we will work with them to kind of develop their mental models. A lot of some firms, and I was fortunate to be at firms where like that they were quite explicit. A lot of folks like kind of know they have like mental models, but they're not super explicit about what those are. And so we'll work with them to help kind of define, okay, what are the types of ideas you like? Let's figure out some of the characteristics that we can drive. In terms of like what is actually happening on the back end, I can't get too much into detail there, just given that's some of the secret sauce. But broadly speaking, what you can think of is we are ingesting lots of transcripts, filings, news flow, various sources of financial data from like FactSet and Visible Alpha, and are first doing a lot of I'll call it like transformation of that data to make it really easy to kind of query and use for downstream research tests like this. And then we're using a variety of models, some that we've kind of fine-tuned on our own, some which are some of the models I was talking about earlier, to kind of do various sub-steps within the investment research process. So like there isn't just one monolith model that's kind of going through this. It's beyond the capability set of any single model today to kind of go through that entire process. But what we spend a lot of time doing is creating really specialized functionality for specific subcomponents of that research task. And those models kind of work together like a team of very focused analysts to ultimately kind of generate an output like the ones you saw.
Yeah, yeah. And David, where is Portrait, or where are we broadly in the industry in terms of Excel integration, right? When I think about idea generation, it's like, oh man, I'm pulling up a comp sheet, or I have 50 models. Like, is it when or will we, or when will we be able to integrate Excel data onto this chassis and say, hey, hey LLM, here's a restaurant comp sheet. Give me 3 interesting ideas from all of this material that I'm uploading to you right now.
Yeah, totally. So it's totally a spectrum in terms of the set of, or I'll call it the level of integration and precision of what the models can do with that data. And where we are today is the models are quite good at taking CSV data. So in other words, if you export Excel into a CSV format and just uploading that into a really capable LLM like O1, it is totally capable of reasoning over that, looking at trends and having some interesting qualitative like insights. So for instance, if you were to upload a table of like you do like a bunch of restaurants and same store sales, and some of them were lagging, it would very clearly be able to point those out and think about the implications of that. What is more challenging, of course, is if you wanted to do things like have the LLM actually build the model or add to the model. There are certainly firms today out there that like Delupa and Canalys and others that where there is some level of like integration in terms of getting historical data into a Excel sheet. And I know there's, I think, a few startups out there that are focused on kind of having the AI write Excel formulas and actually build models. I think though we are because like that is requires a lot of long context reasoning. It's something that's really difficult. And the issue is with anything around AI today, there's always some small probability of failure at any given step. And with a model construction, even if you have 99% accuracy in terms of like formula creation or number pooling or anything like that, the nature of an Excel sheet is if it's a 500 line model with 20 cells, the probability of a failure happening somewhere is just so incredibly high. And at that point, the model breaks, you lose trust in it. And so I think that's one of the things that's really hard. Like, interestingly, where the models are very good at is writing Python code, because that's less about like accuracy at every single cell level. That is much more about let's write general code that we can test and then produce some sort of data frame out of it. So I think we probably need a real leap in model capability to get to the point where like the Excel integration is really replacing a core part of model creation while still having agency and actually being able to express yourself creatively in the model, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. And what we named this webinar series Cutting Edge because what we're trying to do is like figure out everyone's kind of like, what are the leaders doing in the space? I'm like, I don't know, let's ask. And everyone's still kind of asking what the leaders are doing in the space. Like, what do you see from the client perspective, obviously anonymized, like what are some of the most creative or high impact use cases that you're seeing with these tools out there now at institutional firms?
Yeah, it's a great question. Few things come to mind. So the first is uh, I I am amazed at like some of the creativity that folks have on our platform in terms of ways of like mental models that they can create. And the fun thing is like on our platform, you're able to like iterate on that a little bit. So if you have a mental model and you can start kind of layering that in there and actually see the results and go through the case studies and figure out, oh, actually, maybe I should add or subtract this criteria or actually like this thing doesn't really matter. It's been really fun to see kind of folks take their most creative framing and try to translate that into how to get the AI to help with that idea gen. I think there's also been some really interesting use cases with respect to like read-throughs. So thinking about like if X happens, if I search over the entire database, like what are some of the we're seeing a lot today with the presidential election, right? Like there's no shortage of companies that in some form or fashion are levered to something or to some sort of regulatory or policy driven change. And there's a lot of ways people are using the platform today to kind of identify what some of those situations are, and then also go back and look at what happened in 2016 as a proxy for like what could happen again. And the other thing I think is really interesting is, and this isn't on our platform, but I've also seen some really cool implementations of folks like ingesting their call notes and doing more complex things than what I was showing on that page. So for instance, like I know one firm that is taking all their call notes and like basically doing the best way to put it is like in football how you look at game tape to figure out like how you performed and where you made good decisions and bad decisions and doing the same thing but with investments they've had and seeing okay like why did we buy at this level, what was our rationale, what were we seeing, and okay why did we sell here and what could we have known or done better. And one of our goals at Portrait is to be able to actually serve that while also integrating in all the data sources we have. So you end up with like a really personalized kind of case study of here's everything that was happening to the company. Here's everything that was happening to the peers. Here's what the KPIs were doing. Here's what the news flow was and the bull bear case was at these various points. and here's what we were seeing and learning and doing at this time. And that's just like, look, I think a lot of this business is based on getting good at it, is based on experience and having reps, and the capability to like be able to accelerate a lot of that through something like this to me is just like so cutting edge and would be is really, really exciting. So yeah, I think those are some of the things that I've seen people do that are quite interesting, go beyond just sticking a 10K in and asking some questions.
Cool. Cool. If anyone has any questions you'd like to ask David live, feel free to raise your hand. We have a few in the chat. I have a few more. So maybe David, you have time for 10 or 15?
Yeah, I got a few minutes. Yeah, so I see. I'll just rattle through some of these if that sounds good.
Yeah,
That
sounds
I'm
great.
at here. So can I explain what fine tuning is and why it's important? Absolutely. So fine tuning means basically teaching a model a certain behavior by giving it lots and lots of examples. So for instance, there's two ways to interact with these models. One is to write a prompt and to say, here's what I want you to do, or please answer this question. A good example of this is, let's say, I'll use that 10K example prompt, right? Like I specifically said, I want you to compare the two sections of the 10K. Here's what the output should look like. And I just upload the two 10Ks, it reads over it and creates it. The other way to do that is I maybe feed it 500 examples of that, right? So I just give it the two 10Ks. I don't necessarily give the instructions. I can, but really what I'm doing is I'm giving it lots and lots of examples of what I'm looking for. And I can really curate that list of examples I'm giving it. And it's just learning implicitly what I'm doing and learns to copy that behavior effectively. And so that's really important because there are certain tasks where prompting is not going to be good enough. Like the model, in the same way where like I could prompt you how to drive and tell you if you've never driven before, you need to press on the gas and turn the steering wheel. But ultimately, you just kind of need to experience it to actually figure out how to do it. And that's a lot of times like where fine tuning is useful. It's for like tasks that are particularly challenging just to describe in words and where you really need a lot of examples to kind of demonstrate what happens, especially across like a lot of different edge cases. That's where fine tuning comes in and is really useful. And so a lot of what we do, of course, is like if there are particular tasks within the pipeline of a research process, some of them, great, if you prompt it, that's fantastic, it's easy. But a lot of times what you end up needing to do is come up with many, many examples and fine tune a model based on those examples to get really good at that one particular task. Um, so that's what fine tuning is. Let's see, any resources? Yes, I will. There's a few good places to go for that. Anthropic, which it makes the Claude series of models. If you go to their website and just do prompting guide, they have a great overview and a very digestible introduction there. OpenAI has something as well. I believe they have an OpenAI cookbook, which you can Google and get some great prompting tips. There's also, I believe, a Coursera class taught by Deep Learning AI that's just focused on prompt engineering. And I have everyone who joins Portrait, from kind of the former buy side world, I have go through that class. So highly recommend that as well. Um, let's see
One of
some.
the David, you alluded to this a little bit. I
Yeah.
think it was the CEO of Perplexity. I think with I forget who he was with on a podcast. He made an argument that the same way prompting was important for search engines in the early years, that prompting is now not that important, that the tools will get better and that, I guess they'll be able to read our minds more or something. I don't know. But do you think, like, how do you think you noted the prompting has evolved? Like, what do you think the end state on prompting will be in 24, 36, 48 months? Will it continue to
Yeah.
be so critical?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I also think as well that like predicting anything 48 months out is so hard in this space.
Yeah.
But here's what I'd say. So I think it's a little bit of an oversimplification to say that prompting won't matter. It just will be very different. And it totally depends upon the tool that we're talking about. So for searching the web, like prompting, it did matter a lot early on. The AI's got much, much better. And it became much easier. You still need to know how to use Google, but it's a lot easier today. Um, I think if you look back at like how you'd write a prompt 3 years ago or 2 years ago for like GPT-3 series, it would be a totally different experience. And really, what you would be doing there is a lot more of like syntax tricks and lots of examples in the actual prompt itself. Because these models, like if you didn't prompt them correctly, were just really hard to get something good out of. Um, Today, I'm less using prompt engineering as a way um, to like get these models to be able to be performant, and it's more around giving it context and structure of what an output should look like. And that's a little bit different. That's more of less of a here's basic building blocks. It's more of like, hey, here's how I want you to do your job. And I think like over time, these models will become more and more capable, but you're still like as they become more capable, the surface area of what they're able to do will continue to expand. And it will be less about maybe the format. Maybe they'll just, if you say, I want a well-structured format, it will do that automatically. And it kind of does that today. And it'll be more a question of like defining a mental model in natural language, or just saying like, here, I want red flags highlighted for me. I think though in certain domains, like web searching that are quite general, it's easy to kind of anticipate, or it's a little easier to kind of just have the model do a lot of the work. I think in more challenging domains where there's like very specific, language and nomenclature and workflows, I think it's always going to be helpful to be able to like control these models in a more direct way. And just as their capabilities improve, the levers that you're pulling become more and more abstract and high level.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the questions I'm kind of asking all these AI startups is it's my belief that you know, many wannabe Bloomberg killers, I'm not saying Portrait is that, underestimate the value of the data moat, just the depth of the data moat at Bloomberg, FactSet, CapIQ, and in a lot of ways it's accelerating as those platforms add in more alt data and CapIQ buys Visible Alpha, et cetera. Alpha Sense is now this conglomerate with Tigis and transcripts. And so how does the independent vendor like Portrait overcome that competitive data mode? Or said differently, if one of the incumbents overlays the same sort of AI on a deeper data mode, where does that leave Portrait competitively in the environment?
Yeah, it's definitely a very relevant question. And I think to be, I think it goes certainly beyond like portrait and financial services. I think this is true of like any industry vertical where there's like incumbents with lots of data.
Yeah.
Yeah,
By the way, the incumbents usually aren't the best at innovating, but
right, right. No, but so I think, look, like I think if we were to take the view of like like and this is true like in investing and you thinking about any types of disruptive kind of competitor, you never want to play someone else's game on their home turf. And like, look, I love Bloomberg. It's my favorite thing. I still have the app on my phone, and even though I don't have a login anymore, I can't bring myself to delete the app. Um, right? Like I love FactSet. I was such a massive Street Account fan, and I've used their workstation, CapIQ. I love so like these are fantastic businesses, and their data modes aren't going anywhere. And AlphaSense, I was a longtime customer of, as well as Tigis. And so I think the role for a company like Portrait, specifically, but really any AI driven startup more broadly in a particular vertical, is to try to do something that is like just very different, and is over indexed on a dimension that is different than just data availability. So like we're never going to be, at least I should say never, but like very in the short to medium term, Portrait is not a replacement for the breadth of data that you would get from a Bloomberg. But like where Portrait can be really useful is being a member of the investment team and helping with a lot of synthesis. Because that requires a lot of like domain knowledge and having done the job for a while to be able to kind of bring those patterns that we know really well as human analysts into kind of the context of both how you develop and train these models and how you present them in an application that fits into someone's workflow. And so, it's in that sense, like hopefully we were really additive, and it's not that we're trying to replace someone's like terminal or workstation or anything like that. Far from it, and we're not. But like we can be really useful to make better use of data that you have access to find new ideas and use your time more productively. And so I think this is going to be true in investment research. I think it's going to be true in every industry. There's going to be purpose-built solutions that replicate like human level reasoning and synthesis for aspects of whatever that workflow is. And that's what we're building a portrait for kind of the fundamental public market investor.
Great, that makes sense. We should probably end with this last question, which is similar to what I was going to ask. So I'll give credit to anonymous attendee. Any podcasts or newsletters you would recommend to get closer, stay on top of AI developments? And I would add my editorializing. Part of what we're trying to do here is just learn together. So how can we get smarter? What should we be
Oh
paying
yeah. All right. I'm literally pulling up my phone so I can tell you the podcasts that are on my feed.
attention?
So let's see here. There's some great like AI podcasts out there. Like No Priors is a good one. Um, Lex Friedman will have AI folks. They just have the Cursor team on there, which is kind of the leading AI enabled code editor. Cognitive Revolution is good. Practical AI is quite good. Unsupervised learning and Twimmel. Brett, I'll send you this after so you can add it to
Cool.
with it. So and there's a few others. So yeah, I yeah, it's a pretty AI heavy podcast playlist. In terms of, I'm trying to think of any great. I'm sure there are people. I'm not huge on Twitter these days, as much as I used to, but I'm sure I could think of a few folks on Twitter that are worth following as well that I'll throw your way. If you really want to get into the guts and like want to geek out on this, there's a newsletter, a Substack that gets put out each week called NLP Top Papers of the Week. And it's nice. It's like 10 papers where they give like a one paragraph summary about like what the punchline is. And it's a little bit technical, but it's not so technical where you couldn't just take the summary, pop it in the chat GPT and say, what does this mean? And it will tell you like what is the punchline. And that's often great because look, like a lot of times the cutting edge of what is capable is well in the domain before the public knows it. Like ChatGPT is a perfect example. The GPT-3 model underlying it had been around for months, almost probably a year actually before, or not quite a year, probably 6 months before ChatGPT came out as this like chatbot wrapper on top of it. But like there, and today there's a lot of things where I'm sure there are what the future looks like is out there, and so there's definitely between these podcasts and some good Substacks, there's definitely ways to kind of stay on top of what is likely to happen or what is already happening. So I would highly recommend that.
Great. And plug for what we're doing here. We've got a few more in the pipeline. I think ultimately we'd like to do a dozen of these just to talk to people like David who are in the trenches, who are inescapably going to be much closer to all of this than we ever can. So thank you so much for your time and some really great frameworks. And I found it super helpful. I'm excited to get my hands on the a portrait trial and take
Yeah.
it for a spin myself. So thanks so much, David. Appreciate it. And yeah, we will send this. Are you okay with sending your slide deck out?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So we'll send everyone our slide deck that I walked through and David's slide deck. So we have the slide decks and the recording to everyone who registered for the webinar. So
Yeah, Brett, thank you again. This was such a pleasure. If anyone wants to chat AI in any context, please don't be shy about reaching out. And if anyone wants to learn more about Portrait or get more of a deep dive demo, also please or trial it. Please reach out. Thank you again. This has been a lot of fun.
sounds great. All right. Thanks a lot, David.
Take care. Bye bye.